Hello class, this is Professor Morrison and I am going to be doing a quick rundown on how to rig in Maya, and this should be a very basic rigging demonstration to go over all the fundamentals of rigging. I have this quick little gun geometry that I made, this little model. I made it in like half an hour to show off a lot of the aspects of rigging, but we're going to start and jump into it. So to start, I want to actually go over the basic theory of rigging. I'm going to hide this, and I'm going to unhide this example, where I have a cube. I'm going to click this button right here called X-ray joints. This is going to be very interesting. I have a cube that I'm going to call example underscore geo. I have a curve that I'm going to call example underscore CTRL. And I have a joint that I'm going to call example underscore J and T. Actually, if I'm going to make this consistent, I'll capitalize geo as well, because namespaces are important, especially for rigging. Your namespaces need to be at least consistent. So, while we're actually going into this, the basics of rigging is that you have a lot of geometry. You have a mesh. You have the skin of a joint. Not the skin of a joint. Skin of a rig, or of a character, what have you. It is filled with a lot of vertices, and there's this whole thing about vertex order that I'm not going to get into, but just know that it's a thing. But if we're going to animate this, especially if it's going to have a lot of vertices, it's going to be a lot on the engine. There's a lot of math involved, not even in the engine of Unity or Unreal, also just in Maya, also just myself as an animator. That's a lot of work, and I don't want to do it. So instead of going in and individually moving every vertex, which it's a cube, so it shouldn't be that bad, but once you get into a sphere and you see all these vertices, that's too much. Yeah, we're not doing that. We're not doing that. So instead of moving all the vertices, instead of trying to make all the models move onto themselves, why not we move a specific point in space, such as a joint? Why don't we move the joint instead? And we can probably move this joint, but let's say if we have something that's kind of out in space over here, and we want to, like, put it back to a rest 0 position. Okay, that's a lot, and we'll kind of get into a lot of the way joint math works, but the thing about joint math is that it's very complex, and we don't want to deal with it. So, we make controllers. We will essentially do something called skinning. We will skin geometry to a joint so we can move the joint, and that moves the geometry. But again, there's a lot of complex math involved that we just don't want to deal with, so we can then parent a controller to a joint, and then we can essentially just move the controller to move the joint, which moves the mesh. And that is the basics of rigging. You probably have encountered this in some respect, but it's going to be rather complex, and you can build all of this onto each other, but it creates a massive, massive problem if you don't know what you're doing, or just having to deal with all the little complexities. So this is kind of basic. We can be fine. But when we get to something less basic, like a gun, you will start to run into some problems. And then we get into a full character or a full skeleton with all these little bits and bobs, with a full face, with all these little things. You can see how this example is trivial, and you'll beg to go back to the gun for a basic sort of example. I've got a little autosave thing that's I'm gonna have to deal with. But all right, let's actually start with this gun example, and let me show you how to rig it and go over the basics of rigging. Before we go, you'll notice how my gun is set up. We have the test geo, which we have a lot of little secondary bits of geo. We have the main body, and then we have all these other things that are in there. They're a different color. And if I go into my attribute editor, you'll notice that the shader for the body of the gun is just the standard surface shader. It's just a gray Lambert default with Maya when you open it up. But if I click the magazine geo, it's moving parts. The slide is also moving parts. Trigger, moving parts. Stock, moving parts. Dangly bit, moving parts. You don't have to do anything with shaders for rigging, but I called all the stuff that's shaded with the black blend for moving parts because they're going to move. Essentially, a fundamental rule for rigging is that if you are going to have something move, it needs a joint. It needs a joint, it needs a bone, it needs something to move it. Now, if it's going to move, the topology has to be good. Now, I'm not going to pretend that this gun is the best. Again, I made it in like half an hour to show off this demo. But you can tell that, hey, I didn't just make this all one contiguous piece because I want this magazine to move. I want it to be separate. I want the slide here to move, so it's separate. I want the trigger to move, so it's separate. So it's all separate pieces, all in one place. So let's actually start rigging it up. I'm going to go to left view just to have a nice overview of what's happening. Nice orthographic view. And I'm going to go up here in the rigging shelf. Click create joints. And I'm just going to create a joint. This is just going to be I'm going to call this main. This is going to be the main joint that everything kind of latches onto. This is going to be what everything will come from and will guide all of the transformations. So I'm going to move this somewhere. Now, I'm going to move this to the handle. I'm going to move this to the handle for a lot of reasons because, let's be honest, if this is going to move, the movement is going to come from the handle. Joint placement is a fine art, so we're going to go through a lot of stuff on that, but don't think if you didn't get it right once, you're done. It takes a while to learn. But I'm going to create another one, and I'm just going to put into the body here to just serve as the body. I'm just going to have this be the body of this gun. But now it's time to place joints where I think they belong, against all the moving parts. So I'm going to place one right here with the magazine. I'm going to place one right here for the trigger. I'm going to place one right here for the stock. And I have this dangly bit over here that's supposed to dangle. I'm going to place that right there. So I essentially put all of the joints on all of the moving parts. And you can already see something happening. What's happening? You're fine. It's fine. You'll notice that an arrow was created in relation to when I placed the joint. So I placed this joint 1 first, and then I placed joint 2 next. Oh, nope. Joint 2, and then joint 3, and then joint 4, and then joint 5. And it kind of goes up this chain. This chain is super interesting, super important. The way joints work is through hierarchy. So if I move joint 1, joint 2 follows, and because I moved joint 2 when moving joint 1, joint 3 follows, and then so on and so on and so on. Essentially, you have to understand when it comes to rigging, when it comes to all of this, is a parent-child hierarchy. Whatever I do to the parent, the child will inherit. It's kind of basic. It will break your brain, but you'll be fine. So if I mess around with this hierarchy, if I have joint 1, which I want to be the body, and I want joint 2 to be there, next to the body, connected to the body, fine. But I don't want joint 3 to, like, move everything when I try to pull the trigger. That seems like a bad time. So why don't I just remove, through middle clicking, the middle mouse button, from joint 3 to joint 1, and it changes the hierarchy. Now I can move joint 2, and the trigger doesn't move. But if I still move joint 3, all that happens, so I need to keep going. So joint 4 to joint 1, and joint 5 to joint 1. Again, middle mouse clicking and dragging. And we kind of have a basic sort of setup going. Now, I should name this. Naming conventions are absurdly important. If I get a rig and I see this is your naming convention, and it's like, hey, what joint is the problem? Oh, it's joint number 5. I'm going to be mad. I'm going to be mad. I'm going to be disappointed because I don't know what joint 5 is. I need to know what that is. So I'm going to call joint 5 dangly bit underscore JNT to kind of keep in line with my naming convention up here. I'm going to call joint 4 stock underscore JNT. I'm going to call joint 3 trigger underscore JNT. Joint 2 magazine underscore JNT. And I'm gonna call joint 1 body underscore JNT. Very basic naming convention. You don't have to follow this naming convention. I don't think dangly bit is a particularly technical term, but it gets the point across. Again, you don't have to follow a lot of the naming conventions, you just need to be consistent. But I'm also going to call this main underscore JNT, and I'm going to parent the body to the main, because again, I want the main joint to move everything, and I have the body joint kind of keeping everything together. And you can already see the sort of hierarchy just in this setup. The main is the parent to the body, and the main is pointing towards the body, and the body is pointing to all the other stuff. Pretty basic way everything should be set up. So we have our joint... I did not get my slide. I forgot my slide. So I can just put that in there. Put that into body. And call that slide. Slided underscore JNT. Okay, there we are. We have a basic skeleton setup for our rig. But it's not the best, because if we look at all of this, it's kind of even, maybe? A little too even. We need to keep our joint placement in mind. So I think this magazine kind of just being right there is fine. This dangly bit, maybe not. We might need to do something in the future. I would kind of want our slide joint to be over here so it's more in tune with where the slide is. And the hinge, this is where it gets a little really complicated. Where is this going to bend? Now, if you bend anything, not bend, if you rotate anything in Maya, you know how to change your pivot. So let's say I'm going to hit D, and I want to move this down so that it bends. It kind of bends awkwardly through everything. Not the best. But I have this geometry over here that I think could probably be used better for a bend spot. So I'm going to move this joint to that. I'm going to go to top view so I have more control. And I'm going to hit this button up here, snap to points. And now I can move this, and I'm going to try to snap the joint to the center of this part of the geometry, which will, again, be the sort of hinge to our stock. Now I can probably do the same thing here, clicking D, and then moving this there, click off D, and then I can start to rotate. Yeah, that's a much better rotational position. Oop. So if we rotate it from there, you can see that that just looks better. Now again, we're not having the mesh rotate itself, we're using the joint. So keep your joint placement in mind. But we're talking about joint placement. I kind of don't like the joint right here. I might want to have something helping where this joint placement is. So I'm going to make another joint. I'm going to go back to left view. I'm going to make another joint, and I'm going to place this here, maybe? And I'm going to place it here. I'm just going to make a little chain. I'm going to go off of that. And I'll move this joint here that I call the dangly bit. I'm going to move this towards the muzzle. And I'm actually going to call this muzzle underscore JNT. And I'm going to call this joint dangly bit underscore JNT and dangly bit underscore end or end underscore JNT. And I'll move this under the muzzle. Right now, when we're in this point, we have a lot of control over where our stuff is located, how everything is going to be working. So I'm going to put this here so that the dangly bit joint is on the dangly bit geometry. So instead of just having this free floating in space, whenever this piece of geo is supposed to dangle, it's not going to move this weird joint. It's going to move this joint, and this joint will follow in a way. So I feel like this is going to be a more a better joint placement. We also have the trigger oriented to where the gun is, and we'll be doing good. So now that we've set our joints, we put them in the proper place. Maybe a little bit. Let's go in and move that. Yeah, make sure all your joints are placed correctly, because what we're about to do is what I like to call a, I don't want to say a point of no return, but something you don't want to do multiple times. This is a very significant step when you are rigging. Once you start to add skin weights or bind a skin onto a skeleton, it's rather hard to go back, and things start to get very, very funky. So make sure that all of your history is clean, your outliner is clean, all your joints are placed where you want them to be, because this is a very complex step that a lot of people get hit by, and they tend to get really, really frustrated. So if you're having frustrations with skin weights, it's fine. It's fine. But you're going to want to pay attention on what's happening here. So first off, I'm going to select all my geo. So select, shift select, and then I'm going to select here, and then shift select. I'm going to select all my joints. I'm going to select all my geometry, and then I'm going to go to bind skin. And let's see what's happening. We have a colored skeleton. It's no longer that sort of weird blue, gray, black, whatever for that Maya usually has. So moment of truth. Let's try to move this magazine. And hey, it moves, but this shouldn't be moving. The body shouldn't be moving. It should only be the magazine that's moving. Let's try the slide. Okay, it seems to be moving, but not well, and some parts of the magazine are moving with it. That's no fun. This is where we go into skin weight painting, which is this tool right here, Paint Skin Weights. We're in the rigging shelf. Again, bind skin weight is over here. And paint skin weights is over here. So the way the paint skin weight tool works is you have to select some geometry, and you'll see everything. Let's go to body. You'll see every joint that holds some influence over this mesh, over this geometry. So if we select the body geo, you have all this stuff. It's a lot. It's a lot. And you have all these colors because I have the color ramp down here. And if you deselect it, it becomes a lot of gray. And it's kind of hard to see. So I'm going to have color ramp. I like this. So what is actually happening here? So we have essentially a range of influences, a sort of range of weight. You have value 0, and then you have value of 1. I'm going to have value 0 for a second. So when we also have paint operations. So I'm going to go to add, maybe put the value at point whatever, and we start to brush, things start to brighten up, go up on the color ramp. The thing about the color ramp, the thing about the paint skin weights, you have the range of value from 0 to 1. At the end of the day, all of the vertices have to have some value equal to 1. Now, where that is split up from what to the another is anyone's guess, and that's how it should work. Black is 0, white is 1. You want some things with no influence over something, and you want some things with full influence over something. So right now, I want this body geo to be fully influenced by the body joint. So I'm going to go to replace one influence, and I could keep brushing and brushing and brushing and brushing and all of that, or I can just go down here and hit flood, and it all becomes white. That means max influence on this piece of geometry. And now if I move the magazine, all right, we got some stuff going on. Though there is some wonk happening, but it's no longer moving the mesh of the body. That's good. Why don't we go to Magazine Geo and see what's going on with our Paint Skin Weight tool. If we go to Body JNT, yeah, we have Body JNT. It's around yellowish green, so it's about 50%. Magazine JNT, it's about like 40 to 0%. And slide, for some reason, it's around like 1. Let's actually move the slide. Let's see what happens when we move the slide. Very slight, but noticeable. And we don't like that. So again, we don't want the slide joint to be moving anything with this magazine. We don't want the body joint to be moving anything with the magazine. We just want the magazine joint to move the magazine geo. So let's go here, and let's hit the magazine geo in our outliner, and we see that the slide joint is blue. We don't want that, so we're going to go from value to 0 and hit flood, and it goes from blue to black. We want that. Let's go to body, and it's this yellow. We don't want that. I'm going to hit flood at 0, and now, if we go to magazine, it's white. So we essentially got rid of all the influence that the slide and the body joints had over our magazine geo. So all the influence was packed to our magazine joint. It all has to equal 1. This is something that a lot of people get tripped up on. If you are confused by skin weight painting, it is by far the most difficult process of rigging. That's why I'm giving you guys a gun, which is a hard surface, does it have it or does it not sort of influence situation. Because this is complex. And this is why you want your joint placements to be on point, because if they're not, you're going to have to break your skin weights and go back and start again. And no one wants to do that. So make sure your joints are good before you start parenting your weights. This is just a thing that everyone has to deal with. So we kind of need to go in and now kind of figure out what's happening with, say, the slide geo. The main joint, it's got some blue. We don't want that. I'm going to hit... let me show you what's happening if, say, I go into the slide, because I went on the magazine and I flooded everything else to 0. Let's go into the slide and just see main, body, trigger, little bit of stray something there that I don't like. Let me actually show you something on how to deal with this. So, something that happens sometimes is certain vertexes just don't like to do what they're told. And I don't like the fact that I just have that, so I'm going to go up here to select surface objects and click that off. And, well, no, actually, no, I want that. I want select joint objects. And now I can't select the joint, which is really nice when I just want to select some geo. But I'm going to go into vertex mode, and I'm just going to select that. and then go back into geometry. Sometimes there's a thing with weights and the vertices where it becomes a problem with that, like, hey, these are just holding on to the weights for some reason. There's this button called hammer weights, which will kill that and normalize it. This is not that big of a deal here, but sometimes if you move something and like one or two joints, or not joints, one or two vertices just aren't doing what they're supposed to, you can go in and hammer weights and you'll deal with that. That is something that's really interesting right now, but not that like important. But in the future, you'll appreciate that. But if we go to the trigger joint, we are at 0 influence on the slide geometry. We go to the body joint, we got about 50%. We got like 10%. And with the slide geo, it's like 20-ish for some reason, all spread out, all non-even. I don't like that. I want the slide geo to be 100% influenced by the slide joint. So my value is at 1. My paint operation is at replace. I am on the slide joint for the slide geo, and I'm going to hit flood. And it becomes white. And the main joint, and the trigger joint, and the body joint, they're all black, which is what I want. And let's turn back on select joints. And no deformation. It is nice and solid and hard surface. I'm going to hit Z. Boop. And hit Z one more time. Boop, boop, boop. And we're just going to go along and just do all of that. This process is a lot, but it can also just be very meditative. So trigger joint, 0, 1, flood, boom. Stock joint, flood, boom. And we're going to go over to Dangly Bit Geo. And we have the muzzle joint. We kind of don't want the muzzle joint to influence it. Well, it's a weird question. Rigging is a weird little math puzzle where we want the muzzle joint to influence the dangly bit by location, but not by deformation. So we want the muzzle joint here, but we don't want to have any value. So we're going to go to the dangly bit joint, and we're just going to flood it. And this is just a thing, side tangent, when you're rigging. Usually when you have a chain of something, people will have an end joint that is there for the math of everything to work. Because sometimes just relying on, say, the dangly bit to do what you want, and it has no like vector, it's not pointing anywhere, things can get funky. So dangly bits, or not even dangly bits, so like end joints could also be useful if you just want something to hold geometry and the other stuff to not be there. So it's just a thing with end joints. Skip this if you're like not about that, but hey, when you get into character rigging, it can be a problem. So let's actually start to move our joints around. All right. Boop, 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 boop. Okay. And we are nice. Our joints are in the right place. Our mesh is bound to them, and it's all nice and hard surface. And if we move our main joint, everything's good. Place for everything in its place. And we are done with skinning. An advantage of hard surface is you have quote-unquote easy skinning like that. When you get into soft surface, it becomes extreme, and the topology will reflect that. So let's say if I wanted to bend this barrel, I have some edge loops here that will deform everything. But I would need to have a joint here, and however much joints I want there to bend, because hey, if I want it to move, I need to put a joint there. But I don't want that because this is just a basic gun, just knowing that's something for the future. All right, so on to the next step. We have our bones, we have our geometry. Hey, when we move our bones, it's super cool. We can start animating, right? Wrong. We need our controllers. If we go back to our example, we had a controller for our joints. Why would we do that? What are controllers for? Why don't we just animate on the joints? Well, we have a problem. And this is a massive problem. So, let's say I'm animating this magazine, I'm pulling it out, I'm dropping it down, I'm bringing it up, and now I'm going to put it back. Okay, I want to put this back to its rest position. I'm going to go into the channel box and put 0, and that's not good. Let's put this back through undos. The rest position, the thing that we skinned this mesh at, is 3.233? What about, okay. Okay, what's happening here? It's a thing about the way joint math works. Essentially, this joint, or let's go back to this, this sort of joint over here. This joint is that distance away from the body joint. And this joint is that distance away from the body joint. And we can go over here, and yeah, the dangly bit end joint is that distance away from the dangly bit itself, which is that distance away from the muzzle, and it's that distance away from the body. Joints need to be placed in space relative to each other for them to work. Sometimes, and especially in terms of translation, rotation you could do a lot with sometimes, but there's a lot of funky stuff with the orientation, and I'm not going to get into joint axis orientation because this is a lot of information. It'll break your brains. But essentially, you need to know is that if we select all of our joints and then we go into the channel box and we put them all at 0, that happens, and that's not good. When I am grading an assignment like this and I want to check your controllers and joints if they're clean or not, I will do that, and if it does this, no, it's not good. So, we need to find a way to make so that we can animate this joint and put it at a rest position and be fine without screwing up the underlying math. So, in comes the curve. So I'm going to select a curve. Open it. All right, there we are. NURBS curve, circle. I'm going to call this magazine underscore CTRL. And I'm going to place that on our magazine joint. In fact, I'm actually going to move that a little. I can place that there, and it should be fine. And now I'm going to create another one, and I'm going to move that. It might be a little difficult. In fact, I'll hide this geometry with H, and I'm going to move this controller over here, and I'm just going to create a bunch of controllers, and I'm going to move them to where they need to go. So this was slide CTRL. This is stock CTRL. And this is going to be trigger CTRL. And I'm going to have this as dangly bit underscore CTRL. And you know what? Why don't we put one for our main joint as well? So I'm going to have this as, even though it's the main joint, I'm going to call this the handle CTRL, because at the end of the day, this is going to be moving the handle, the grip. So we have all of that. Now let's bring our stuff back. This is not ideal. This is not an ideal setup. I kind of don't like this. We're going to have to move all of these joints around to make them easier to work with, to make them make more sense. Because at the end of the day, a rig is going to be a tool that an animator is going to be using. So we need to make this tool ergonomic. Let's flex our design skills. So when we were moving stuff around, we just kind of moved it to a place. We can move something up. I'm going to go back here to snapping mode. I'm going to move this here, and we'll be fine. But I also don't like how all of this is all the same color. So I'm going to change that. So selecting a controller, I'm going to go to Attribute Editor, and there should be Object Display. And under Object Display, Drawing Overrides. And I want you to click Enable Overrides, and we have this color index. I'm just going to move this over. Let's say we want this to be... Let's say we want this to be yellow. Just for some reason. I like yellow here. The controller becomes yellow. Real nice. Now, let's go over here to the trigger. Let's say I also want this to be yellow. Alright, cool. Now, I want to change its position. So I'll go into the rigging channel, or the rotate channel, set it as 90. I'm going to move it a little off to the side and shrink it down. So I don't have to go digging into the mesh to select my controller. And we can also do that here. We'll be fine. The slide, I think, is something that we might want to use. So 90, boop. Shrink it down a little bit. It doesn't have to all be uniform. I can do sort of this to make some interesting, funky controller shapes. Interesting, funky controller shapes are cool. I'm not getting into them. And I'm going to move this down here. And maybe shrink this a little. And, oh, I need to go back and change the color. So I'm going to make this... purple for some reason. I'm thinking purple. And I want to make this... Actually, no, I'll make this purple and I'll make the other things... I'll make these green. Essentially, I want to start to build up a sort of visual language, because again, the animator who's going to be using this is going to have to, at a glance, look at it and really sort of figure out what each thing is supposed to be doing. So I'm going to make this one... let's make this one white. So I have this sort of visual language where the yellow stuff will rotate. I'm going to rotate that trigger. I'm going to rotate that stalk. While the green stuff kind of translates. And the dangly bit is kind of a little dangly bit. It's not that important. While the white one will influence all the other colors. So we have this sort of thing going on. Great. But if we kind of look here, remember how I said you needed to clean everything up? Oh, we have stuff in the channel box. We have weird scales. We have weird translations. I don't like that. We need to go in and freeze and delete history on everything. Because if we don't, we'll cause problems in the future. Again, what I did with the bones earlier, if I... No, I don't want to select all that. Actually, no. Let's select all these controllers. Again, I did this, and I want to be able to move this around. Nothing's connected. But when I'm done moving it, I want to set it to the rest position. So I want to just go over here, hit 0, and it's done. This is back at rest. This is back where it was made. If I don't do that, if I don't have clean controllers, and if I do this number, it all kind of collapses in on itself. I don't want that. That's why we use controllers, to make it all nice and clean. So I'm going to come in here, modify, freeze transformations, delete history. Modify, freeze transformations, delete history. Modify, freeze transformations, delete history. And lastly, modify, freeze transformations, delete history. And I think I can, yeah. I'm going to make sure that the pivot for all of these controllers is oriented to the joints itself. Because right now, this is just kind of floating. I don't like that. So I'm going to hit D. I'm going to go into snap to points. And I'm just going to move this down to the controller itself. So now we're going to hide our geometry again. So, boom. And just adjusting it, boom. And adjusting it, boom. Because if we don't do it, I'll actually show you what happens if we don't do it on this one. Because I find this will be interesting. I'll use this as a bad example for the future. So, we do all of that. We have our controllers set up. All of our joints are... All of our controllers match the translation pivot to the joints. They're all clean. We should be good to start making constraints. So now we have our joints. We have our controllers, and the joints move the mesh in a way we want, but the controllers do not. The controllers do not move anything. The controllers are just our controllers. There's no movement, nothing. The reason being is that our controllers are not attached to our joints. So if we look at our example here, if I move the controller, it moved the joint, which is what we want. We do this with a variety of constraints. So if you're in the rigging window up here, you have constraints. If you're also in the rigging shelf, you have a lot of constraints here too. Now, there's a lot of constraints for a lot of things. I'm not going into all of them. You'll learn them as you go, because you'll have a situation where, like, hey, I want something to point at something. How do I do that? Oh, aim constraint. Cool. Things like that. But we need to start constraining things. So we have this magazine controller. We want to put it on this magazine joint. So I'm just going to hit parent constraint. And under magazine joint, there's this little red thing. Magazine joint parent constraint. If we click on that, we don't really want to think about this right now, but essentially it means something. What does it mean? Let's move our controller. Boom. We have our controller attached to our joint, which is attached to the skin. Whoa! That was a lot of work. This is a lot of video to just get to this point. This is why rigging is a lot. And there's this whole step-by-step process. So we are at a good spot. Now let's go for this trigger, and let's attach here, and we hit parent constraint. Cool. Let's go onto that, and what's happening here? It's not moving. And there's this weird stuff in our channel box. What's happening? When we did that with magazine, this little constraint popped up. When we did it with trigger, it didn't pop up. Hey, what's with this plus box next to trigger? Oh, okay. If we move the joint, it moves the constraint. Okay, this is weird. Let's delete that and look at trigger again. It's gone. And if we look at magazine, we see that it's blue. So blue in the channel box essentially means that there's a constraint happening. There is something happening with the math here that essentially says something else is influencing it. So if I move this around, do a little rotational stuff, and then look back on the joint, okay, it's updated. New stuff happened when I moved it. That's kind of what we want. So we can move this back to 0, and it'll be fine. But what was happening here with the trigger and the controller? So you have to be very specific with what you select as you're selecting it. There's a mnemonic that I really like. I don't really think it's a mnemonic, just a little mental trick, I know. I need to also understand what the logic of what I'm trying to do is happening. I want this trigger joint to be moving this, this trigger controller to move this trigger joint. So I'm going to select the trigger controller to be the parent, the trigger joint to be the child, control click, and then I'm going to hit constraint. And then the constraint appears under the joint. Boom. Now, as I move my controller, the joint moves with it. That's what I want to happen. Now, let's do a bad example again. Let's just say, like, oh, I click these, cool, what have you. I don't know, I don't care. Both of them. Well, I can't. It won't let me. I need to select both of them individually. So, again, I don't care what's happening here. Bad example. I'm going to select the stock joint. I'm going to select the stock controller because it's down the outliner. That's how it works, right? Then I'm going to hit parent. And because I selected stock first, that's the parent. stock controller, that's the child, and the child gets the constraint. So now if I move the stock joint, it moves everything, it moves the controller, and if I move the controller, nothing happens. It's a whole situation. Let's go back. There we are. So stock controller, stock joint, constraint. And slide controller, slide joint, constraint. Again, parent, child, constraint. And I think the slide has it, the muzzle, like the muzzle doesn't have anything. The stock controller has it, the trigger has it, the magazine has it. We're almost there. We got a lot of things going on. But now we're going to go down here, and I said, hey, I'm going to do something as a bad example. I have this down here. Let's say, oh, I'm going to go parent, child on the dangly bit, constraint. It's fine. We should be good. Let's move that around, and oh, what's happening? What, oh my goodness. Oh my gracious. What's happening here? Well, the pivot for the controller is what is ruling everything here. So, if it's parent, child, constraint, oh no, that's not good because it's not great. So let's actually see, I want to see what's happening here. What I need to do is I need to move this pivot point of the controller to match the pivot point of the joint. Nope, that's not it. Oh, okay, I still have the constraint happening. So let's just go into the outliner and kill it. So, dangly bit, shift, control click, there, but, there you go. So, there we go. I'm on the dangly bit controller. I hit D to move the pivot. And I'm going to go here to make sure that it is locked to the pivot of the joint I want. And let's check. Okay. It's not moving the joint yet because we need to parent it, but it is moving in the relative space that I want it to, which is good. So dangly bit controller, dangly bit joint, parent. And there we go. We're cool, we're cool, we're cool. Before we move on, I want to talk about this joint here, the muzzle joint. The muzzle joint is interesting on this gun for a couple of reasons. One, because it makes it so that this dangly bit is not just flying in space and causing some weird funkiness with the rig. We're kind of anchoring it. This muzzle joint does not really have any skin weight painting, so what gives? So, at the end of the day, this muzzle joint is the muzzle of a gun. Let's say in engine, we want to have a muzzle flash. We want to play something where the bullets are going to fly out. How are we going to do that? Where is it going to go? How is that going to work with the logic of the gun? So, say we have this gun in engine, and we need a muzzle flash to have a point of location, a projectile to have a point of location. We create something on the rig, on the prop rig itself, such as this joint. It doesn't serve any purpose with the animation, but with the actual purpose of the prop in the engine, it serves a lot of purposes. So, when you're creating a rig, you need to keep that in mind as well. In another version, when I taught this demo before I recorded this video, I had joints on the sights, because if the character's gonna like aim down sights, we need the camera to focus on something. So why not put it there? Sometimes I might put a joint on the end here for the stock for the character's shoulder to run up on. There's a lot of things you can do with this. Let's go back here. We have the handle. The handle itself is going to serve as the main joint, and we should actually just parent this. So parent main constraint, because we want this to move everything, and we'll put like the character's hand on this, kind of as a socket joint. If you've screwed around with socket joints in the engine, this is what that joint's about. But it's also serving as our main controller, our handle controller, and we want it to move everything, so let's do that. That's not good. Oh no! Something was wrong! Oh my goodness! Oh my gracious! What's happening? Well, if we look at our bones, the bones have a hierarchy. If we look at our controllers, they don't. They're all just kind of floating in space. So, nothing bad. We're just gonna select all of these controllers and move them to essentially make them children of the handle. So, the handle, there's no deformation happening on this. There's no real control, like animation happening on it. It's not moving parts of the geo, but it's moving everything along with it. Bam. Bang. Bang. And now, can I just put it that? We have a rigged gun. So now that the gun's rigged, we can get to animating it, and we can do a lot of stuff with all of this. If you don't know how animation works, hit S to set a key. And we can start to animate things. And again, we want the rest position of everything to be at 0. So if we go over here and say, hey, I want a key here, but I want all of this to be at 0, I can hit 0 and bam. And we can see what the animation is doing. We can figure this all out. Now we've made something that an animator can start touching and figuring out what to do with it. At the end of the day, everyone who's making a rig, they needs to understand one thing about rigs. You are making a tool for somebody else to use. So if you make it with all these weirdnesses and you have all these things where it's like, hey, it works here if you do it correctly, well, you're gonna have somebody else working on it. So you have to be very specific with how you set it up. Rigs are something that's absurdly powerful, something that's very good, and in this major for a couple years, not a lot of people have invested in it. But because it's so valuable, people who have become rock stars of the cohort. And riggers are in high demand in the industry. If you're an animator and you know a little bit of rigging, you'll go far. If you're a character artist and you know a little bit of rigging, you'll go far. You can get an entire career just doing rigging. It's very good. Please explore. You may not like it. You might bounce off of it. But as long as you know a little bit, you can be a very valuable member of the team. So, there you are.